All right, in this video, we'll be looking at Unit 3, the skeletal system, talking about the skull in particular today. The skull is the body's most complex bony structure. It's formed by 8 cranial bones and 14 facial bones. The cranial bones encase and protect the brain and provide muscle attachment for the head and the neck muscles. The facial bones have several functions. They form the framework for the face. They contain cavities for sense organs. They provide air passages. They secure the teeth. They anchor facial muscles, which show expression. Most skull bones are flat bones, except for the mandible. All skull bones are firmly united by interlocking joints called sutures. And the sutures you can see here, these joints, these are immovable joints, so your skull bones don't move around. Major sutures, you can see them here. There's the coronal suture. Coronal means face or sun, so it's kind of like the face. The sagittal suture, which you can't see here, it's along the top. That's like the sagittal plane, divides the body in half. There's the squamous suture here on the side. And then there's the lambdoid suture, which you can't really see in the back right here. And those sutures are for the major cranial bones. A little bit more about skull geography. There are a couple things that we will use when talking about the skull. There's the cranial vault, and this is the bones surrounding this cranial cavity, which is where the brain will be setting. There's the cranial base, which is this base layer. You can see it also here, this cranial base. The cranial cavity is here in the middle. It's where the brain is. There are the middle and inner ear cavities. Can't really see those in this picture. Can't really see them in this picture either, but they are the holes in the side of your head where your ear bits go. There is the nasal cavity as well, and the nasal cavity involves these conchae or concha, these different plates that are found inside the nose. The orbitals, or the orbits, which is where the eyes are, and then the different sinuses, which are just pockets of air that have several functions for us making sounds and lightening the skull and so forth. And then there are 85 named openings for nerves and blood vessels in the skull. We will not be naming them in this class. So specifically look at the cranium now. A couple things here for the cranium. It's made up of 8 different bones. We're going to go through each of them. First, there's the frontal bone. It's easy because it's in the front. And a couple things about the frontal bone. It's the anterior aspect of the cranium, forms superior margins of the orbitals, so the top part of the orbits here, and most of the anterior cranial fossa. I didn't talk about cranial fossa. Cranial fossa is where the brain, these little dips where the brain sits in. And so the frontal bone has this anterior cranial fossa here, like the frontal lobe of your brain. All right, the parietal bones, which actually form a majority of the cranium. You have 2 of those, one on either side. And most of the superior is the top of your head, and the anterior are the lateral aspects of your skull, and it connects with all the major sutures as well. The parietal bone does. The occipital bone, which is this one here in the back, forms the posterior wall and base, and is the posterior cranial fossa also. And here, the little dip where the brain sits, which supports the back of the brain and particularly the cerebellum, the lower portion of the brain, which we'll talk more about when we get to the nervous system. Another big thing for the cranium, or for the occipital bone, is this hole here called the foramen magnum. This is where the brain or the spinal cord comes and meets into the brain. So obviously, very important part of that. And then you also have these occipital condyles, which you can see down here in the bottom. These condyles are where that thing is in the way. You can see it there, occipital condyles. That is where the skull articulates with the first vertebra. And so that's how your skull attaches to your backbone. Then there are the temporal bones. The temporal bones are the side of your head. We call this the temple, so that makes sense. There's two of those, obviously, one on either side of the head. They are inferior to the parietal bones. They have this really irregular shape because they have these holes in them. These for your ear. They also have the back half of your cheekbone, and so very important bone. But they are the one that have this hole in the side where your ears are. And a couple other cranial bones. The sphenoid, which is this odd bone here in the base of the skull. You really can't see it from here, just barely. There's the sphenoid right there, kind of comes out behind the eyes and is really right in the middle of the bone. It actually articulates with all other cranial bones, and it's called a keystone piece because of its central location, and it kind of keeps the whole skull together. Then there's the ethmoid, which you can see here. Can't see as much here. You kind of see it back there in the back and back here, and it's the deepest bone of the skull between the sphenoid, the nasal bones of the face. So here's the nasal bones of the face. It's way back in there. Forms some of these nasal concha, which you can see really well in this picture. These like plates that give the nose surface area. And now let's look at the face. Right, the face, there's the mandible. This is the lower jaw. This is the largest and strongest bone of the face. It forms the chin, which is the bottom jaw, has, of course, the teeth coming out of it as well. Then the upper jaw is the maxillary. It is the unmovable portion of your jaw. Your upper jaw cannot move. The central portion of your face, all other facial bones except the mandible articulate with the maxillary bones. And so the mandible actually articulates up here with the temple. And so the maxillary bone does touch it, obviously, when you close your jaw, but doesn't articulate it. But all other facial bones touch the mandible. And you have two of those, one on either side of your face. You have the zygomatic bones, which you can see here, this blue bone. It forms the front part of your cheek. You have the lacrimal bones right here. These little bones on the side of your eyes. They actually house the tear ducts. So that's what the lacrimal, that word means. The palatine bones, which I don't know that I have a good shot of the palatine bones. They are in the roof of your mouth, and they form the palate, the hard palate. So right behind your upper teeth, you can feel that hard palate up there. That's the palatine bones. The vomer, which forms the nasal septum. So you can see the vomer in here. It's this little tiny blue bone right in there. So very small bone. So this is like what divides the two parts of your nose. You have the inferior concha. So the inferior nasal concha, that's these little green pieces back in here. And then the hyoid bone, which I neglected to get a picture of also, sadly. The hyoid bone is a small little U-shaped bone that does not articulate with any other bone, and it's actually found below your bottom jaw. And so if you were looking at someone, it would be like up in their neck underneath their chin. And so the hyoid bone's purpose is it serves as attachment points for speech and for swallowing muscles. And it has the distinction of the only bone in the body that doesn't actually touch any other bone. So it's pretty interesting.